From 12 News, this is Newsmakers.
Welcome to Newsmakers. I'm Tim White. Ted Nesi is off this week. We're coming to you on location from outside Washington County Superior Court, where the criminal trial of Aaron Thomas and the so-called naked fat test case has been going on for weeks now. We want to bring you key moments from the trial and bring you moments that the jury has been trying to consider as they decide the fate of Aaron Thomas. And for this conversation, I'm joined by my colleague from Target 12, Eli Sherman, and from the Boston Globe, Amanda Milkovits. We've been covering this trial every day now, and of course, we first launched this investigation through our reporting back in 2021. I want to note to our viewers that we're having this conversation on a Thursday afternoon, and most of you are watching it over the weekend, so there may have been a development on Friday that we're not going to discuss here. Okay, so I'm going to set the stage. Aaron Thomas is facing 2 counts, second-degree child molestation and second-degree sexual assault. He has pleaded not guilty to both of those counts. He's accused of inappropriate contact with hundreds of students, really, over 3 decades during those so-called naked fat tests. The state began, as the state always does, their case. Prosecutors Tim Healy and Meg Thompson presenting some 19 witnesses, right, and including 10 former students. So when you zoom out 30,000 feet, so far over 16, 17 days of this trial, what has stood out to you most? Eli, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I think that the thing that stands out most to me is that this is a tall order for the jury. You know, unlike a murder trial where there might be a gun and the fingerprints of the defendant on it and residue on his shirt, this is really going to come down to credibility and whether the jury finds that the former students who are coming forward and accusing him of this inappropriate contact are being truthful, or Aaron Thomas, who has acknowledged that, you know, this was inappropriate and that they were getting naked, but he disputes all of the key facts in the case that would rise to the level of criminality. So for the jury, they're really going to have to say, is it Aaron Thomas who's telling the truth, or these students?
All right, Amanda, what stood out to you in the case?
Well, I think the thing that's really stood out to me the most in watching this from the beginning is that we're not here. Nobody is here. The North Kingstown School District isn't here. If it wasn't for any of these former student athletes coming forward, first in 2018, when they bought the fat testing machine that Aaron Thomas was supposed to be using, and then in 2021, when a former student athlete again contacted the superintendent's office and said, please investigate. And now we've seen 10 of the former student athletes testifying on behalf of the prosecution and 4 testifying on behalf of the defense. And they're telling a pretty consistent story about their experience, which supposedly 600 athletes have gone through.
And it's interesting, a consistent story not only among the government witnesses, but when you fold in the defense witnesses, the former students, they're saying, yes, I went through that same testing. Their framing of it is it wasn't inappropriate in their mind.
But to a point. Now, the first student athlete who testified for the defense was asked in cross-examination, I think it might have been by Megan Thompson, about would your opinion change if you knew that even Aaron Thomas said you did not need to be naked for this test, that this is not considered, you know, testing the groin is not considered a valid site. And you saw his face change and wait. No, I would question that, why that happened.
Right.
So it's been really interesting to watch this evolve.
And of course, after that, defense objected to that line of questioning with other former students. So, Eli, I agree with you that this is a he said kind of case, because there isn't that smoking gun, the physical evidence, there's no DNA or anything like that. And prosecutors have that very high bar beyond a reasonable doubt. They have to not only prove the act, but they have to prove the intent, which is getting in the subjective mind of the defendant. Any criminal case that is difficult, but especially here, the intent that they have to prove is that he did all these tests for the purposes of sexual gratification. How are prosecutors trying to present that to the jury right now?
Yeah, like you say, it's an almost impossible thing that we see come up in trials all the time, is trying to improve intent. And the way you do that is you bring in all of these former students that we heard from, and they walk through all these different things that happened to them. Now, the key thing with this case, of course, is that there's just one student, the one that's connected to the second-degree sexual assault charge where they have to prove this intent. On the child molestation charge, and correct me if I'm wrong, Tim, I believe it's just that they have to prove that the molestation happened when the student was 13 years or younger.
It's called strict liability. You don't have to prove that.
Right, so it's even more narrow because it's not a bunch of students that we're talking about in this case specifically, it's just the one. And so, we've heard directly from that student who says that, yes, the intent was clear with Aaron Thomas when I was testing with him alone naked inside of his office. And then we just heard from Aaron Thomas who said, absolutely not, that didn't happen. So again, it really does come down to, for the jury, which one of them is being truthful.
All right, Amanda, Eli, why don't we bring folks inside the courtroom so they can hear some big chunks of testimony. And of course, we want to play testimony from Aaron Thomas himself. It is unusual, we should point out, for a defendant to take the stand in their own defense because there's a risk to it. Not only are they going to face questions from their own attorneys, but they'll face questions from prosecutors. Here now is some moments from direct examination of Aaron Thomas from his attorney, John Calcagni.
When you look back on it today, obviously it's 2025, you've experienced the brunt of this entire process, and times have changed. Do you have thoughts and feelings about your prior practices?
I do. I'm truly sorry that it occurred the way it occurred. It was never my intent to ever hurt, cause any kind of pain, or embarrass, or make uncomfortable even any of the student athletes. It was just for competitive, for a competitive advantage. But when I look back on it now, I see how it can be, how it is construed. I take full responsibility for it. It was a foolish thing, based on, not just today's standard, but now even I look back on it when it was occurring.
During the course of your meeting with police, did you answer their questions?
I did.
Were you truthful with them?
I was not completely truthful, no.
And why were you not completely truthful with the police?
At that time, it was about 10 days after I had been suspended by the school department, and I was trying to do whatever I could to find out who was behind this, because I didn't know if it was the same individual, but more importantly, how quickly I could get back to my basketball team. We were headed for the playoffs.
Detective Mulligan asked you a number of questions, one of them asking namely whether or not any of the students during the course of the testing process were fully nude or naked, correct?
Yes.
Were you truthful with him
No.
when he asked that question?
I was not.
Why didn't you just tell Mulligan that, yeah, just like you've told us here, in certain points of the test, I asked the students if they, remove their boxers for the inner thigh pins test. Why didn't you just tell them?
I should have done that. It would have been the right thing to do, and it would have prevented a lot of the embarrassment I've gone through. I didn't do it because I'd already talked to Dr. Auger about it, and I'd already told him this wasn't true. Thinking that I could get back to the team faster, that was my best answer.
What did you think would have happened to you or your job if you told Detective Mulligan that, yeah, the students were naked, that was part of my testing process, I've been doing it for 30 years, and there's been over 600 members of the program. If you laid it out just like that, what was your concern?
My concern was I would definitely lose my job.
And why did you think you'd lose your job?
I thought any investigation, any mention of topics like this, just the way they explode in the media, and it's just going to, everything's going to build up against you. There's no way to come back from it. That's why I'll never teach again or coach again. I know that's over.
When Detective Mulligan, did he ask you if you implemented the shy or not shy question as part of the process?
He did.
And that you told him that that related to the removal of a shirt, right?
Correct.
Was that truthful?
No.
Why were you untruthful about this related component of the questioning?
Just another opportunity that I was concerned for my job, for myself at that time, that, what's the quickest path to get back to coaching? That was why I was so focused on that, and it's so wrong to be focused on that, but I was so focused on that.
Why should anybody believe anything you have to say here in this courtroom, considering your prior lies to Detective Mulligan?
In this courtroom, I'm under oath. I've sworn to tell the truth, and I've told the truth, and I will continue to tell the truth.
Are there any other reasons why we should believe you today?
I've lost everything from this, from jobs, my ability to teach, coach, embarrassment, being in the media every day. unfortunately, it's completely changed everything. And I realize I take ownership of it because that's what I do. I believe that, when I look at this now, I say, yes, I understand how this is considered wrong.
That was some testimony from Aaron Thomas through direct examination by his attorney, John Calcagni. When we come back, we're going to have cross-examination of Thomas by prosecutors. Stay with us. You're watching Newsmakers. Welcome back to Newsmakers. I'm Tim White on location outside Washington County Superior Court for the criminal trial of Aaron Thomas in the so-called naked fat test case. A reporters roundtable joined by Eli Sherman from Target 12 and, of course, from the Boston Globe, Amanda Milkovits. And we're taking you inside the trial this week for this special edition of Newsmakers. So we heard from, direct examination of Aaron Thomas in the first half of the program here. Amanda, I think one of the, as Eli points out, there's no real physical evidence, no smoking gun, no DNA evidence, but one piece of evidence that I think was very telling to the jury, and I know you were watching them closely, so was I, is the police video from inside North Kingstown Police Department. It was in 2021 when he was being interviewed by Detective Mulligan. And
that actually was the first time that we heard Thomas publicly in this trial. We heard his explanations and watched him basically lie. He basically lied as they asked him direct questions about how he conducted his tests. And you saw him in the moment trying to come up with answers. I'm watching the jurors. Some of them are shaking their heads. They're writing furiously. They're very interested in this trial. But that was something that I think caught everyone and that Thomas had to answer for when he was finally called to the stand.
Now, his explanation to that, of course, Eli, is that he lied not because he was trying to hide a criminal conduct. He lied because he wanted to get back to the basketball team, which was on a playoff run. He lied because he wanted to get back to his job. He was suspended, for 10 days, I think, at that point. And as you point out, the question is, what version is the jury going to believe? Is that the risk of putting a defendant on the stand here?
Absolutely. I mean, you mentioned it at the top of the show. It's not something that defense attorneys will always recommend to their client because it opens you up to all sorts of these direct questions from prosecutors who can be, it could be as simple as, why did you lie? Mm-hmm. And let's not forget that it's not the first time that he lied about it either, because he admitted on the stand himself that back in 2018 when he was questioned by then Superintendent Phil Jay, that he also lied about students not being naked. And so, you put those two things together and you see it so clearly in the questioning from prosecutors that this is really what they're highlighting. This is really what they're focusing on when they're trying to convince the jury, don't listen to this guy, he's a liar.
Well, why don't we take a listen to that moment now. Here's some cross-examination by Assistant Attorney General Tim Healy of Aaron Thomas.
Are you shy or not shy? That's the question, right? That's the question that you asked hundreds of high school boys over the years. Is that right?
Yes.
That's the question you asked them in a windowless room. Is that right?
There was a window on the door.
That window was covered, right?
Yes.
Nobody could see inside that room,
yes.
Right? The door was closed when you asked that question.
Yes.
You waited until you were alone in the room with them until you asked that question. Is that right?
I believe so.
You knew of the influence that you had over these kids, right?
As their coach?
As their coach, as their teacher, as a person in a position of authority. You knew that influence that you had over these kids.
Yes.
You knew that some of these kids would run through a wall if you told them to, right?
Yes.
You could have asked that question about whether they were going to wear clothing in any number of different ways, and you chose that confusing way. Isn't that right?
I did choose that way, yes.
You could have let students know prior to entering that room that you were going to ask them to get naked, right?
Yes.
You could have asked them before they were alone with you and told them about getting naked, right?
Yes.
You could have put it on that consent form, those consent forms that we see that are going home to the parents. You could have done that, right? And put that kids were going to be naked.
It's possible, yes.
And if it was on those forms, we saw there's a version of those forms that parents reviewed and signed. Parents would know that their kids were going to be alone and naked in a room with a coach. Is that right?
If it was on a consent form, they would know, correct?
That question, that shy or not shy question, that's the question you lied to police about, right?
Yes.
You've testified here today over the past few days about that you've had issues finding employment since 2021, since this all came to light. Is that right?
That's correct.
And you said it was a result of the media coverage. Is that right?
I believe I said that, yes.
You were hired in 2021 by Monsignor Clark, which was a Catholic school, right?
Yes.
Right. You didn't tell them that you had students alone, naked in a room with you for these fat tests, right?
No.
All right. You didn't tell them the reason for your departure from North Kingstown High School, did you?
No. I believe they did their own research.
Well, you've admitted you lied to the police, right?
Yes.
And you've admitted that you lied to the school administration, right?
Yes.
All right. And those were situations where you were confronted, where your back was up against the wall and you were being confronted with this question about these boys being naked alone in a room with you, right?
I was being confronted about the testing program, yes.
And when your back was against the wall, you lied. You lied to the administration and you lied to the police, right?
Yes.
And you lied to Dr. Auger in 2018?
That would be the school, yes.
All right. And you lied to Sergeant Mulligan in 2021, right?
Yes.
And as you testify here today, you've sat here and you've listened to all of the witnesses, right? You've had the opportunity to listen to every single witness prior to you taking the stand and telling your story, right?
Correct.
All right. And you also had the opportunity, you've talked about the state providing you with discovery. You've had the opportunity to review all the discovery and go through it with your attorneys and look at everything, right?
Yes.
All right. And this is the first time that anyone is hearing this version of events, right?
Which I'm confused about which version of events you're referring to.
That you're admitting that these boys were naked alone in a room with you, right?
Oh, yes.
Your testimony is that you did it that you had the kids naked to get an accurate reading and for efficiency, time efficiency, right?
Yes.
Right. In all those years, did you ever see anything, a big red stop sign telling you to stop getting kids naked?
I did not.
No.
And as I said the other day, it's on me. I was wrong. There's no question about it, but I did not see that. I got so caught up in the fact that this worked. It was a habit. I entered the data. The kids got results. We would work to get better. It worked.
We've talked a lot about your truthfulness, right?
Yes.
And you've admitted that you weren't completely truthful about the testing to Dr. Auger, to Sergeant Mulligan, right?
Yep.
In those situations, your back was up against the wall, right? You were about to be in trouble. There was bad things for you were going to happen if you told the truth, right?
I would lose my job probably, yes.
And your back is against the wall here today too, right?
It is.
Yep. Nothing further, Judge.
Aaron Thomas on cross-examination from state prosecutors. Okay, Eli, so we want to point out that there was a near 2-week hiatus in this case. The judge is dealing with a family medical emergency, and that also means the days are a little bit shorter. Testimony tends to wrap up by 1 o'clock. This has gone on much longer than anyone ever thought. I think the estimate was a little over 2 weeks of testimony. We've passed that.
Yeah, I mean, just Wednesday, I believe, was the 1-month mark from the beginning of witness testimony, and don't forget that they did jury selection before that. So, they've been here since the end of March, easily every day. And, one of the things about that stands out to me, Tim, is that, as you mentioned, the prosecution starts the case by calling their witnesses, and that's when we heard from a lot of these former students. what that means for the jury is that they're getting further and further away from that student testimony. So just think about the memory of everything that they, talked about, everything that they said. It'll be interesting to see whether or not that has an effect on their ultimate decision.
So the dominant feature of this trial, Amanda, we have about a minute left before we go to break. The dominant feature of this trial has been, 5 days of testimony from Aaron Thomas.
Right.
What was your takeaway from him on the stand?
What I really took away is the lies of omission, and that's something that the prosecution has been trying to hammer on. The opportunities that he had to be straightforward and upfront about what his testing program was all about. That students were basically, boys were basically naked and alone with him in his office, even after he was told not to be doing it. He still found a way to continue, and the way he justified it was saying that, well, even though I was told to stop, 4 or 5 of them still asked if they wanted to do it. It wasn't his fault. He was asked to do it.
Well, we'll see how much of that penetrates with the jury when it gets to jury deliberations. Okay, final thoughts on the Aaron Thomas criminal trial when we come back. Stay with us. You're watching Newsmakers. Welcome back to Newsmakers. I'm Tim White on location outside Washington County Superior Court for the criminal trial of Aaron Thomas. Just a little time left here. Eli, final thoughts as the trial itself, we assume, is coming to a close soon.
Yeah, and then it'll be handed over to the jury, obviously, for deliberations. And, Tim and Amanda and I, we've covered a lot of trials. And one of the things that you look for is, okay, if deliberations start and they come back quick, that means that they had their minds wrapped up.
Not a lot to talk about.
Not a lot to talk about.
Yeah.
Let's get moving on. If this goes on for more than a day in deliberations, I could see, just given the breadth of everything that we've heard from, that it could go on for a while.
All right, Amanda, final thoughts.
Okay, so one thing I found really powerful with the alleged victims' testimony is they started every single one of the prosecution witnesses with a picture of them as they were when the FAT test started from their yearbook. Some of the boys, young men, actually started chuckling, but a few of them teared up looking at themselves.
Yeah, I have to remind viewers that they're adults on the stand testifying here.
Right. But this brought you back to this is who they were when they were alone with Coach Thomas naked.
That's right. So, all right, well, it's a fool's errand to predict what jury is going to do, so we'll have to stay tuned to see how they decide this case. Look, we have done our best to bring you multiple weeks of this trial and compress hundreds of hours of testimony to give you an idea of what's been going on. We hope we've brought you some insight inside the trial throughout the days today on Newsmakers, but if you missed any of it, please go to WPRI.com. We have continuing coverage, and to our friends over at the Boston Globe, to thebostonglobe.com to see their coverage of the Aaron Thomas criminal trial in the so-called naked fat test case. I want to thank you for watching, and we'll see you next week on Newsmakers.